My late husband, Frank O'Malley, had a philosophy about the world. And it was this: most things in life, whether it's a marriage or a transmission, can be fixed with patience, the right tools, and a healthy dose of respect for how the damn thing was built in the first place. For the 50 years we were married, he was the master mechanic of our lives. He fixed leaky faucets, broken hearts, and the endless parade of ailing automobiles that came through the big bay doors of his garage. In South Philadelphia, O'Malley's auto repair wasn't just his business, it was his kingdom. A loud, greasy, and profoundly honest kingdom built on the simple, unshakable principles of a fair price for a good day's work. I was his queen. Or, as he preferred to call me, his chief surgical assistant. For 50 years, I was the one who handed him the wrenches, who cleaned the grease from his gnarled, knowing hands, who listened to him diagnose a faulty alternator by the specific quality of its whine. I didn't just watch, I learned. I absorbed it all through a half-century of loving osmosis. I learned the language of engines, the secret music of a perfectly tuned carburetor. I could read a wiring schematic better than I could read a recipe. I knew the difference between a remanufactured part and a cheap knockoff from a mile away. I was in secret one of the best damn mechanics in South Philly. But to the world, I was just Marge, Frank's wife, a retired nurse who brought him his lunch in a pail every day, a sweet old lady. It was a role I was happy to play. After Frank passed 2 years ago, I closed the garage. I couldn't bear to be in there without him. The only piece of his mechanical soul I kept running was our car, our baby, a 1968 Buick Skylark, the color of a summer sky, with a pristine white vinyl interior. We had bought it for a song in the 70s, a rusted-out wreck, and we had spent the next decade restoring it together. Every part, every bolt, every inch of that car was a memory. The small, almost invisible scar on the dashboard was from the day I had slipped with a screwdriver and he had teased me about it for a week. The driver's seat was perfectly molded to the shape of his body. The engine, a massive 350 V8, had a low, contented rumble that was as familiar and comforting to me as the sound of his own snoring. The car was not a machine. It was the last living, breathing piece of my husband. And it was the one thing in the world I still knew how to fix. The breakdown happened on a Tuesday in early spring. The sky was a brilliant, hopeful blue, and the first cherry blossoms were just starting to appear. I was on my way to the grocery store, the Skylark humming along beautifully, the radio playing a golden oldie. And then, with no warning, no sputter, no cough, the engine just died. The power steering went, the radio went silent, and I was just coasting. I managed to steer the heavy, silent beast to the side of the road. It's beautiful, sky blue. Who now just a useless, decorative piece of steel. I was not a panicking damsel in distress. I was a mechanic. I knew the symptoms. It wasn't the battery. It wasn't the alternator. It felt like fuel starvation. My first immediate diagnosis was a failed fuel pump. A $75 part and a few hours of frustrating knuckle scraping. Work, a problem I could have easily fixed in my own garage, but I was 70 years old. And my days of lying on a cold concrete floor, wrestling with a fuel line, I had promised my daughter, over. I needed a mechanic. And for the first time in 50 years, it couldn't be Frank. The old neighborhood, Frank's neighborhood, was gone. The small, independent, family-owned garages we had known for decades had all been replaced. One was now a yoga studio. Another was a fancy artisanal coffee shop. Frank's own garage, which I had sold after his passing, was now a CrossFit gym. The world had moved on, so I did what any modern, technologically bewildered senior citizen would do. I pulled out my smartphone and I Googled auto repair near me. The first result, the one with the 5-star rating and the slick professional looking website, was a place called Vinny's Auto Excellence. The website was full of smiling photos of clean-cut mechanics in matching uniforms, pristine, white-floored workshop, and a long list of impressive-looking certifications. It looked clean, looked professional, looked like the exact opposite of my Frank's beautiful, chaotic, and grease-stained kingdom. I called them, and I had my baby, my beautiful, silent Skylark, towed to the lion's den. The waiting room at Vinny's Auto Excellence was a masterpiece of calculated deception. It had a leather sofa, a flat-screen television showing a sports talk show, and a gleaming Keurig machine with a carousel of flavored coffee pods. It was designed to feel like a luxury lounge, to soothe the customer, to make them feel like they were in a place of competence and quality. It was all a lie. A good mechanic's waiting room should have a worn-out vinyl chair, a 10-year-old copy of a car magazine, and the faint, honest smell of gasoline and hard work. This place smelled of air freshener and fraud. A young man emerged from the workshop. He was in his 30s, with slick, gelled hair, a perfectly trimmed beard, and a brilliant, white, predatory smile. His work shirt, a crisp, gray button-down with his name, Vinny, embroidered on it, was so clean it looked like it had just come out of the package. This was a man who had never had a drop of grease under his fingernails in his entire life. "Mrs. O'Malley," he said, his voice a smooth, confident purr. "Vinny, thanks for trusting us with your beautiful car. A classic. You don't see many of those anymore." "It was my husband's," I said, my voice small. I was already, unconsciously, playing the part he expected me to play. The sweet, clueless, sentimental old woman. "I've had my head tech take a look," he said, his own face now a mask of grave professional concern. "And I'm afraid it's not good news." He led me out into the workshop. It was as clean and sterile as a hospital operating room. My Skylark was up on a lift, a single mechanic looking at it, not with a tool, but with a tablet computer. So Vinny began launching into his performance. The initial symptoms pointed to a fuel delivery issue. And that's part of it, but it's a symptom, not the cause. He started spouting a beautiful, flowing, and utterly nonsensical river of technical jargon. He spoke of cascading electrical failures, of catastrophic compression loss, of significant piston slap. He was a poet of the unnecessary upsell. He was painting a picture of an engine on the verge of a complete apocalyptic meltdown. I listened, my face a mask of my own. A mask of wide-eyed grandmotherly confusion and concern. Piston slap! Oh my! That sounds serious. But in my head, I was a seasoned poker player, and I was watching a man with a pair of twos try to bluff me with all the confidence of a royal flush. Everything he was describing was nonsense. The engine in that car was one of the most reliable V8 South ever built, and Frank and I had rebuilt it ourselves just 5 years ago. It was in perfect health. I played my part. I asked a few simple, innocent-sounding questions, the kind a clueless old lady would ask. "Oh, dear. So it's not just the fuel pump." Then he almost laughed. "The fuel pump," he said with a condescending chuckle. "Oh, no, Marge. We are well beyond the fuel pump. The fuel pump is the least of your worries. The entire engine. Shot. It's a miracle you even made it this far. I had him. In my head, I heard the satisfying click of the trap springing shut. He had taken the bait. He'd seen the sweet, helpless old woman, and he had decided to go for the kill. So, does that mean? I asked, my voice trembling with a perfectly feigned fear. Can it be fixed? It can, he said, his voice now the solemn, reassuring tone of a surgeon about to perform a life-saving and very, very expensive operation. But it's going to be a big job. We're talking a full engine rebuild. New pistons, new bearings. Rehoning the cylinders, the whole 9 yards. It's the only way to make her safe again. He led me back to his clean, quiet office and began to type on his computer. He printed out an estimate and slid it across the desk to me. I looked down at the number at the bottom of the page, $8,247.51. It was a beautiful, audacious, and utterly fraudulent number. The real repair, the one I knew the car actually needed, would cost at most $200, including labor. He was trying to scam me out of $8,000. He was a thief, hiding in plain sight, armed with a clipboard and a confident smile. I looked at the estimate. I looked at his handsome, smiling, and deeply dishonest face. And I gave him the most helpless, most confused, and most perfectly grandmotherly look I could muster. "Oh my," I said, my voice a frail, bird-like whisper. "That is, so much money. I'll have to think about it. I'll have to talk to my daughter." I stood up, my movements the slow, careful motions of a fragile old woman. "Thank you so much for your expertise, young man. You've given me so much to consider." I walked out of his office, out of his pristine, fraudulent kingdom, and into the honest, sun-drenched air of South Philly. The fury in my heart was a cold, quiet, and beautiful thing. He had not just tried to steal my money, he had insulted my intelligence. He had belittled my lifetime of experience. And worst of all, he had used the language of my husband's sacred, honorable craft, too. Tell me a series of ugly, profane lies. He thought I was a helpless old woman. He thought I was an easy mark. He had no idea who I was. He had no idea I was Frank O'Malley's wife. And he had no idea that I was about to, in the most quiet, most polite, and most devastating way possible, dismantle his entire fraudulent life. I paid the tow truck driver in cash and watched as he unhooked my beautiful, silent Skylark, leaving her beached in my driveway like a sad sky-blue whale. Vinny's parting words echoed in my ears, a syrupy, condescending poison. "You let me know when you've talked to your daughter, Marge, but don't wait too long. An engine like that can seize up completely if you let it sit. It's a ticking time bomb." A ticking time bomb. The only ticking time bomb, I thought, was the one in my own chest, a furious, indignant pounding that was threatening to blow a hole in my grandmotherly facade. I stood in my driveway for a long time, just looking at the car. She looked so forlorn, so out of place. A car like that, a car with a soul, was meant to be driven, to be heard. Its powerful engine a roaring, joyful song. The silence was a sickness. The thought of what had to be done next was a heavy, daunting weight. The answer, of course, was in the garage. Frank's garage. It had been his sanctuary, his cathedral of the internal combustion engine. And for the 2 years since his passing, it had been his tomb. I had locked the door the day after his funeral, and I had not stepped inside since. The thought of entering that space, of breathing in the ghost of him, of being surrounded by the tools he would never hold again, was a grief I did not think I could bear. I spent the rest of the afternoon in a state of agitated paralysis. I watered my garden. I did the crossword puzzle. I tried to read a book, but my mind was not there. It was in the driveway with the silent car, and it was at the door of the garage, terrified of the ghost on the other side. The $8,000 estimate from that slick, smiling charlatan Vinny was more than just a scam. It was a challenge. It was a desecration of the very craft my Frank had held so sacred. He was using the language of my husband's life to tell me a series of ugly, profane lies. And the thought of letting him get away with it, the thought of my husband's beloved car being butchered by that salesman, it was a betrayal I could not stomach as the sun began to set, casting long, lonely shadows across the lawn. I knew what I had to do. My grief for Frank was a vast, deep ocean. But my rage at Vinny was a new and surprisingly powerful ship. And it was time to set sail. The old brass key to the garage's side door was exactly where Frank had always kept it, on a small, magnetic hook hidden inside the mailbox. My hand was trembling as I put the key in the lock. The tumblers were stiff from 2 years of disuse, but with a grunt of effort, I turned the key. The lock gave a loud, protesting clack. I pushed the door open. The smell hit me first. A beautiful, holy trinity of scents that was the pure, distilled essence of my husband. Old motor oil, a faint, sharp temps of gasoline, and the sweet cherry wood scent of his pipe tobacco. The smell was so sudden, so powerful, so completely and utterly Frank that it buckled my knees. I had to lean against the doorframe, my eyes flooding with tears, a wave of grief so profound it was like a physical blow. For a moment, I thought I couldn't do it. I thought I would have to close the door and call the tow truck and surrender the car to the wolves. But then my eyes adjusted to the dim, dusty light, and I saw it, swirled, just as he had left it. It was a time capsule, perfectly preserved, museum of a good man's life. His tools, a lifetime's collection of wrenches and ratchets and sockets, were all hung in their perfect, orderly places on the pegboard wall, their outlines traced in black marker, a system of organization that had always been a source of quiet pride for him. His old battered radio was on the workbench, still tuned to the classic rock station he loved. A dusty, forgotten coffee mug sat next to it, a brown ring at the bottom. The air was thick with the dust of 2 years of silence, but it was also thick with the spirit of him. He was here. I could feel him, and I felt the grief, so sharp and so painful, begin to recede, replaced by a new, strange, and powerful feeling. A feeling of purpose, of resolve. I was not a trespasser here. This was my home, too. I had spent thousands of hours in this garage, my hands as greasy as his, my ears full of the sounds of his work, my heart full of the quiet joy of being his. Partner, I walked over to the tall metal locker where he kept his work clothes. I opened the door, and there they were. His old blue grease-stained coveralls hanging on a hook, still holding the faint, familiar shape of his body. They were a sacred vestment, a warrior's uniform. I took them off the hook. I took off my sensible cardigan. And with a slow, deliberate, and deeply ceremonial reverence, I put on my husband's clothes. They were too big, of course. The shoulders slumped, the legs were too long. But as I zipped them up, I felt a strange, powerful sense of transformation. I was not just Marge the grieving widow anymore. I was O'Malley, the surgical assistant, and I had a patient to diagnose. I opened the main garage door, the heavy springs groaning in protest. I pushed the Skylark inside, the car rolling silently into its familiar spot on the cool concrete floor. I turned on the bright fluorescent work lights. The garage was suddenly a brilliant, buzzing operating theater. And I was the chief surgeon. I started, as Frank had always taught me, with the basics. I was a nurse for 40 years. I knew the first step was always to check the vitals. I popped the hood, the familiar heavy thunk of the latch, a comforting sound. The engine, Frank's masterpiece, was dusty but beautiful. I checked the battery terminals, clean and tight. I used the multimeter to check the charge. 12.6 volts. The battery was perfect. I checked the oil, clean and full. Pulled a single spark plug. The electrode was a healthy grayish tan, not fouled, not burned. The spark was good. It was just as I had suspected. This was not a dying engine. It was a healthy engine that was simply not getting its food. It was fuel starvation. I walked over to the workbench, to the wall of tools. My hand knew, from a half-century of muscle memory, exactly where to go. The fuel pressure test kit. I connected the gauge to the Schrader valve on the fuel rail. "'Kay, Frank," I whispered, to the empty, watching garage. "Let's see what we've got." I went to the driver's seat and turned the key to the on position, not to start the car, but to prime the fuel pump. The dashboard lights came on, but the fuel pressure gauge did not move. It sat at a perfect and deeply damning 0. There was no fuel pressure, not a drop. My initial roadside diagnosis was correct. The heart of the fuel system, the pump, was not beating now. I had to be sure. I had to confirm the point of failure. This was the part I was not looking forward to. The fuel pump on a '68 Skylark is located, in its infinite wisdom, on the top of the fuel tank, which meant I had to get under the car. I found the old creeper, the padded board on wheels that I had spent so many hours on, and I rolled it under. The car, the smell of the dusty concrete floor, the cool, dark underworld of the chassis. It was all so familiar. I looked up at the complex, beautiful geometry of the exhaust pipes, the drive shaft, the underbelly of the beast. My husband had taught me the name of every single part. I was a stranger in a familiar country. I found the electrical connector for the fuel pump, a small two-pronged plug. I used the multimeter again, this time to check the voltage. "'Kay, George," I said to the ghost of my husband, my voice echoing slightly under the car. Hit the key. I reached out with a long stick I had prepared and turned the ignition just for a second. The multimeter probes connected to the plug jumped 12 volts. The pump was getting power, but it was not making a sound. It was not vibrating. It was dead. The diagnosis was complete. The patient was not dying of catastrophic heart failure, as Dr. Vinny, the quack, had proclaimed. The patient had a simple, common, and easily fixable clog in a single minor artery. The fuel pump was dead. A $75 part. And that slick, smiling, condescending thief had tried to charge me $8,000 for it. I rolled out from under the car and just lay there on the creeper on the cold, dusty floor of my husband's garage. The single bare work. Light above me was a harsh, interrogating glare. And I looked at the tools on the wall, at the grease stains on the floor. at the profound and deeply and beautifully honest world of real work my husband had built for himself. And then I thought of Vinny, of his clean shirt, of his soft, uncalloused hands, of his fancy Keurig coffee machine, of his easy, profitable, and deeply, deeply dishonest lies. He had not just tried to scam a widow. He had not just tried to steal my money. He had taken the sacred, noble craft of a good, honest mechanic. A craft my husband had dedicated his entire life to, and he had twisted it into a cheap, ugly, and soulless confidence game. He was a parasite, feeding on the ignorance and the fear of innocent people. He was a disgrace to the uniform, to the old, grease-stained coveralls that I was now wearing. The last of my grief, the last of my hesitation, was burned away in that moment, replaced by a fire, a cold, quiet, and utterly implacable fire. I had my diagnosis, I had my proof. My quiet, personal second opinion was complete. But I was no longer interested in just fixing my car. I was interested in justice. A bigger and far more satisfying kind of justice. I stood up, and I wiped the grease from my hands with an old red shop rag, the same way I had seen Frank do it 1,000,000 times. The time for mourning was over. The time for diagnosis was over. It was time to go back to the world and to perform a different kind of surgery. It was time to cut the cancerous, lying, and fraudulent heart out of Vinny's auto excellence. Don't you worry. Frank, I whispered to the quiet, watching. Ghosts of the garage, I'm going to fix this. Lying on the cold, dusty concrete floor of my husband's garage, a grease-stained wrench in my hand, and the undeniable truth of a dead fuel pump just inches from my nose, my grief finally, blessedly turned to rage. The 2 years of quiet, hollow sadness I had been living in were over. The fog had lifted, and in its place was a cold, clear, and beautifully focused sense of purpose. Vinny, the slick, smiling charlatan with the clean fingernails, had not just tried to scam me. He had not just insulted my intelligence. He had desecrated this sacred space. He had used the language of my husband's honorable, lifelong craft to tell a series of profane, greedy lies. And for that, he had to pay. My revenge would not be a simple, angry phone call. It would not be a bad Yelp review. It would be a quiet, meticulous, and utterly devastating campaign of truth. I would not stoop to his level. I would rise above it, and from that great height, I would drop the full, crushing weight of the facts directly onto his fraudulent little empire. I spent the rest of that evening cleaning. I did not touch the Skylark. The $75 repair could wait. Instead, I cleaned the garage. I swept the floors. I wiped the dust from Frank's old workbench. I organized his tools, which were already perfectly organized. A quiet, meditative act. I was not just cleaning a room. I was preparing my mind. I was clearing out the cobwebs of my own grief, making space for the cold, hard, and deeply satisfying work to come. My first act of war was a simple one. I went into the house and I made a pot of coffee. I sat down at my kitchen table, which I now thought of as my command center, and I opened my laptop. My target was no longer a faulty fuel pump. It was Vinny's auto excellence. And my first line of attack was a single innocuous photograph. The day I had been at his shop, while he was in the back performing his 5-minute, $8,000 diagnostic, I had, out of a strange nervous habit, taken a picture of his waiting room to send to my daughter. A picture of the leather sofa, the Keurig machine, the big flat-screen television. and on the wall behind the sofa, a proud, ostentatious display of his supposed credentials. A wall of lies. I opened the photo on my laptop. I zoomed in. The quality was good. I could read the text clearly. There were a half-dozen certificates, all in expensive-looking frames. Excellence in Customer Service, 2023. Certified in Foreign Auto Repair. And in the center, the biggest and most important, one of all. A large ornate certificate with a gold seal. The National Institute for Automotive Service Excellence is pleased to recognize Vincent "Vinny" Petrucci as an ACE-certified master automobile technician. It was the holy grail of a mechanic's qualifications. And it was the first thread I was going to pull to unravel his entire fraudulent life. Something about it had bothered me from the moment I saw it. It looked too perfect, too clean. Frank's own master mechanic certificate, which still hung in a dusty frame in the garage, was a humble, dog-eared thing. Its seal faded from years of sun. This one looked like it had been printed at a Kinko's last week. I went to the official A's website. It was a dry, professional, and deeply serious-looking site, as it should be. The A's certification is the bedrock of a mechanic's credibility. It is the one thing a customer can trust. And deep in the site, I found what I was looking for: a public searchable database of every single certified mechanic in the country. Verify a credential, the link said. My heart began to beat a little faster. I looked at the photograph of Vinny's certificate. It had his full name and a certification number. I typed the number US 77491B into the search bar. I took a sip of my coffee, and I hit enter. The website processed the request for a moment, and then a single, beautiful, and utterly damning line of text appeared on my screen in stark red letters. No record found for this certification number. I let out a small, quiet gasp of pure, unadulterated joy. It wasn't just a hunch. It was a fact. It was a lie. The centerpiece of his professional identity was a complete and utter fraud. But I was just getting started. One lie was not enough. I needed more. I needed to know the full scope of his deception. I spent the next 10 hours in a deep, obsessive dive into the public records of Mr. Vincent Petrucci. I was a 70-year-old widow, a retired nurse. And for one long, glorious night, I became a private investigator. I started with the business licenses for the city of Philadelphia. I found the license for Vinny's Auto Excellence. It was registered as a simple automotive repair shop. Not a certified one, a small but legally significant distinction. Then I began to search for him. I searched the alumni databases of every single technical college and trade school in a 100-mile radius. There was no record of a Vincent Petrucci ever having graduated or even attended any of them. He had no formal training, none. The real breakthrough, the secret that would become the core of my case against him, came from the world of social media. On a hunch, I searched for his name not on the professional sites, but on the trashy, forgotten ones. I found an old, dormant MySpace profile under the name Vinny P. The profile picture was a grainy, low-resolution photo of a much younger Vinny. His hair slicked back, wearing a cheap, shiny suit, standing in front of a row of used cars, a big, cheesy salesman's grin on his face. His listed occupation: sales associate at Honest Abe's Auto Plaza. The whole ugly picture snapped into focus. He wasn't a mechanic at all. He was a used car salesman. A man who had spent his life learning not how to fix cars, but how to lie about them. He had simply taken his talent for deception and moved it from the sales lot to the service bay, a far more lucrative place for a man with no morals and a gift for performance. He was a complete and total imposter. My digital investigation was complete. I had the hard, factual proof of his fraud. But it wasn't enough. I needed to understand the human cost of his lies. I needed to know if I was his only victim or if I was just the latest in a long line of them. It was time to take my investigation into the field. I began my campaign of quiet, grandmotherly espionage the next day. My first stop was the neighborhood diner, the one a few blocks from Vinny's shop. The place where all the old-timers from the neighborhood gathered for their morning coffee. I sat at the counter, a sweet, harmless old lady in a cardigan, and I listened. I stirred my tea, and I gently, expertly steered the conversation towards the topic of cars. "Oh, my old Buick broke down the other day," I said with a sad, helpless sigh to the man sitting next to me. "I had to take it to that new place, Vinny's. He seems like such a nice young man." The man, a retired plumber named Sal, snorted into his coffee. "Nice," he grunted. "The man's a damn thief is what he is. I took my wife's car there for a simple brake job. Kay tried to tell me I needed a whole new transmission. I've been driving for 50 years. I know what a bad transmission sounds like." The man's a crook. A woman a few seats down chimed in. "He told my daughter her car needed 4 new tires, said they were bald. She's a college kid, doesn't know any better. She paid him." I looked at the old tires he took off. They were practically new. One by one, the stories came out. Flood of quiet working-class resentment. He had scammed them all. He had preyed on their daughters, their wives, their lack of expertise. And he had gotten away with it, because who was going to challenge the nice young man with the fancy computer and the wall of official-looking certificates? My next stop was the internet. I went home and I began to meticulously go through every single online review for Vinny's Auto Excellence. The 5-star reviews were, as I had suspected, a joke. They were all vague, generic, and used similar stilted language. "Great service. Very professional. Highly recommend." They had all been posted within the same few weeks. They were fakes. But the 1-star reviews. The 1-star reviews were a gold mine. They were specific, they were detailed, and they were full of the same righteous, helpless fury I had felt. Stay away. This place is a scam. I came in for an oil change, and they tried to sell me a $3,000 catalytic converter replacement. I took it to another shop. The real problem? A loose gas cap. Vinny is a condescending, arrogant liar. He spoke to me like I was an idiot because I was a woman. He gave me an estimate for $2,000. My dad. A real mechanic fixed the problem in his driveway for $50. There were a dozen of them, a dozen other victims. A dozen other people who had been lied to, scammed, and disrespected. I spent the entire afternoon tracking them down. I found a few of them on Facebook. I sent them a polite, carefully worded message from my own grandmotherly account. "Hello," I wrote. "My name is Marge O'Malley. I'm a retired nurse from South Philly. I am writing to you because I believe I was also a victim of a fraudulent business practice at Vinny's Auto Excellence. I am in the process of gathering information for a formal complaint. Would you be willing to share your story with me?" The responses came in almost immediately. Ha! They were a chorus of angry, grateful validation. Yes, they would be willing to talk. Ha! Yes, they would be willing to sign an affidavit. Ha! Yes, they wanted to see that man get what he deserved. My quiet one-woman investigation had just become a class action rebellion. The final piece of my investigation was the most old-fashioned, a stakeout. I wanted to see his operation with my own eyes. Ha! I spent an entire afternoon parked across the street from his shop, sitting in my daughter's sensible sedan, a pair of bird-watching binoculars in my lap. And I watched. I saw him in his element. I saw him charm a young, nervous-looking college student into a set of expensive, unnecessary new tires. I saw him patronize a middle-aged woman, showing her a dirty air filter he had clearly pulled from a trash can, and convincing her she needed a full engine flush. And I saw him turn away a group of young, confident-looking men who clearly knew their way around a car. He wasn't an equal opportunity scammer. He was a predator. And he preyed exclusively on the people he perceived as weak. The people he thought wouldn't fight back. As I sat there watching this smug, confident charlatan run his crooked kingdom, I felt the last of my own quiet, grandmotherly softness burn away. This was not just about my car anymore. This was not just about my husband's legacy. This was about my neighborhood, my city. It was about all the other people who worked hard for their money, who trusted a man with a clean shirt and a professional-looking certificate to be honest with them. I had my evidence. I had my witnesses. I had my target, and I understood his methods. My dossier was complete. It was a beautiful, terrible, and utterly undeniable record of his crimes. The time for quiet, patient investigation was over. It was time to think about the public and deeply, deeply satisfying presentation of my findings. It was time to find a bigger stage, a much, much bigger stage. My kitchen table, for the second time in my 70 years of life, had become a war room. The first time, it had been a place of quiet domestic strategy, where my husband Frank and I had mapped out the finances for his first garage, our first home, our children's futures. It was something else entirely. It was the command center for a quiet, one-woman intelligence agency. The target was no longer a mortgage. It was a man. My dossier on Vincent Vinnie Petrucci was a thing of beauty. It was a thick, meticulously organized binder filled with the irrefutable factual evidence of his own fraudulent life. I had the digital proof of his fake certification. I had the signed, notarized affidavits from a half dozen of his other victims. I had a detailed log of his predatory business practices. In short, everything I needed to destroy him. My first thought was the law. A simple, clean, and direct complaint to the Pennsylvania Bureau of Consumer Protection. But as I considered it, a familiar, weary cynicism began to set in. I knew how the world worked. A complaint would be filed. It would sit in a bureaucratic purgatory for months, maybe years. Vinny, with his slick, professional image, would hire a lawyer. He would claim it was a smear campaign by a rival. He would drown the investigators in paperwork. And in the end, he might get a small fine, a slap on the wrist. But his business, his beautiful, fraudulent machine for stealing money from the innocent, would continue to run. No, that was not justice. That was paperwork. My revenge, I decided, needed to be more personal, more public, and a whole lot more satisfying. Frank had always loved a good story. I was going to turn Vinny's downfall into the best story this neighborhood had seen in years. I went to the living room and turned on the local evening news. I watched with a new, critical eye until I saw what I was looking for. It was a segment on Channel 12, wedged between the sports and the weather. Quote, "The Philly Fanatics got your back." The host was a man in his 40s named Dan Abrams, a journalist with a flair for the dramatic, a slightly cheesy, self-righteous anger, and a very large local following. He was a consumer protection crusader, a man who took a special theatrical glee in exposing scammers and con artists. He was, I realized, the perfect stage for my little opera. Finding the number for the Channel 12 investigative tip line was easy. Getting through to Dan Abrams himself was a different story. I spent a full day navigating a labyrinth of automated phone menus and deeply unhelpful production assistants. But I am a woman who spent 2 decades dealing with the Philadelphia public. School systems bureaucracy. I am not easily deterred. Finally, I managed to get his producer on the line, a young, stressed-sounding woman named Kelly. Consumer Watch. "This is Kelly," she said, her voice a bored monotone. "Good afternoon." "Kelly," I began, my voice a perfect grandmotherly coo. "My name is Margaret O'Malley. I am a retired nurse from South Philly. And I believe I have a story for your Mr. Abrams. A rather significant one." "'Kay, ma'am, what's the nature of your complaint?" she asked, a familiar, patronizing weariness in her tone. I could hear her typing in the background. She was already dismissing me as another crank caller. "The complaint," I said, my voice still sweet, but with a new hard edge of steel underneath, "is a multi-year pattern of systemic consumer fraud, including predicate acts of wire fraud and mail fraud, being perpetrated by an unlicensed, uncertified, and completely fraudulent automotive repair business that specifically targets women and the elderly." The typing on the other end of the line stopped. I continued, my voice a calm, steady rhythm, irrefutable. "Documentary evidence that the business owner is operating under a series of forged professional credentials. I also have the signed, notarized affidavits of 6 other victims who are willing to go on the record with their own stories of being systematically defrauded. And I have, myself, a personal and deeply compelling story to tell." I paused, letting the weight of my perfectly prepared pitch sink in. "Does that sound like something Mr. Abrams might be interested in?" There was a long, stunned silence on the other end of the line. "Ma'am," Kelly said finally, her voice now full of a new, profound, and deeply professional respect. "Can you hold for one moment, please? I'm going to put Mr. Abrams on the line." The meeting took place the next afternoon. Dan Abrams and his producer, Kelly, came to my house. Dan was exactly as he was on television. A little loud, a little theatrical, but with a sharp, intelligent, and deeply cynical glint in his eyes. He was a man who had seen every scam in the book. I sat them down at my kitchen table, and I served them coffee and a plate of my homemade Irish soda bread. And then I presented my case. I did not just tell them a story. I gave them a trial. I handed them my beautiful, terrible dossier. I watched their faces as they went through it. I saw their expressions shift from professional skepticism to intrigued curiosity, to a kind of giddy, journalistic bloodlust. They were not just looking at a story. They were looking at an award-winning multi-part investigative series. They were looking at a ratings bonanza. "This is incredible." "Marge," Dan said, his eyes shining as he looked at the printout of Vinny's fake certificate. "A complete fraud. And you uncovered all of this yourself?" "My husband, Frank, was a mechanic," I explained. "The best in the city. He taught me a few things. I took them out to the garage, to Frank's garage. I showed them the Skylark. and I told them our story. The story of the car. The story of our life. Dan looked around the garage at the old, honest tools, at the faded calendars on the wall, at the profound and deeply authentic spirit of the place. "This is the heart of it," he said, his voice a low, reverent murmur. "The honest, old-school craftsman versus the slick, new-school con artist. It's a perfect story." He looked at me, a new, ambitious idea dawning in his eyes. "It's not enough to just report this, Marge," he said. "We need to show it. We need to catch him in the act. We need to do a sting." "A sting?" I asked, my heart giving a small, excited leap. "Yes," he said, his eyes gleaming. "We wire you for sound. We put a hidden camera on you. We tow the car back to his shop. And we let him hang himself with his own fraudulent rope. Live on camera." He leaned in, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "What do you say, Marge? You feel like becoming an undercover agent for a day." I looked at the grease-stained coveralls still hanging on the back of the door. I thought of Frank, and I thought of that slick, smiling, condescending thief. "Vinny, I'd be delighted," I said, a slow, wicked smile spreading across my face. The preparation for the sting was the most fun I'd had in years. The channel. 12 News van, a big, anonymous white van, was parked in my driveway for 2 days. The tech crew, a group of young, nerdy, and deeply respectful men, turned my living room into a temporary surveillance hub. They were like kids in a candy store, listening to my stories of Frank, of the old neighborhood, of the golden age of American muscle cars. They fitted me with the gear. The camera was a tiny, ingenious little thing hidden in a plain silver brooch on my cardigan. The microphone was a wire that ran down my back. They placed 3 other cameras inside the Skylark itself, one on the dashboard, one facing the driver's seat, and one under the hood, aimed at the engine. The moment he opens that hood and starts spouting his nonsense, the tech guy explained, "We'll have it all in glorious high definition." Dan and I rehearsed the script. I was to be Marge, the sweet, confused, and slightly dotty old widow. I was to be helpless. I was to be trusting. I was to lead him down the garden path of his own arrogance, to let him dig his own grave on camera, for the entire city of Philadelphia to see. I had been playing this part my whole life. I was a natural. The morning of the sting was bright and clear. I put on my best, most grandmotherly outfit, a floral print dress, a sensible cardigan, and, of course, the secret agent brooch. The tow truck arrived. We loaded up the Skylark, my beautiful, silent, and still broken Trojan horse. The news van would be parked a block away from Vinny's shop, recording everything. "You ready for this, Marge?" Don asked, as I got into the passenger seat of the tow truck. "Young man," I said with a cool, calm smile, "I have been ready for this my entire life." I walked into the waiting room of Vinny's Auto Excellence, a small hidden microphone taped to my chest, a high-definition camera pinned to my sweater, and a heart full of glorious, righteous larceny. Vinny was at the counter, a look of surprise and then a greedy, predatory delight on his face when he saw me. He had thought I was a fish that had gotten away, and now I had seemingly swum right back into his net. "Marge," he exclaimed, his voice a river of fake, syrupy warmth. "You came back! I was so worried about you and about that beautiful car." "Well, dear," I said, my voice a perfect, quavering whisper of elderly confusion, "I spoke to my daughter, and she agreed with you. You're the expert. If you say the car needs fixing, then it needs fixing. His smile widened. The fish had not just returned. It had jumped right into the boat. "You've made the right decision, Marge," he said, patting my hand in a gesture of condescending reassurance. "You can't put a price on safety and peace of mind." He had the car brought into the workshop, and he performed his fraudulent song and dance for me all over again. But this time, the entire city was watching. He opened the hood, and he began his long, beautiful, and utterly damning monologue of lies. He pointed to the clean, perfectly functional engine parts. "You see this, Marge?" he said, pointing to the alternator. "That's your main compression valve. It's completely shot." There is no such thing as a main compression valve, I thought, a silent, joyful laugh in my heart. He went on, a magnificent, soaring aria of automotive nonsense. He told me my spark plugs were suffering from chronic vapor lock. He told me my radiator was leaking headlight fluid. He was not just a liar. He was a creative, inspired, and deeply, deeply ignorant artist of the lie. And then I led him to the grand finale. "Oh, dear," I said, my voice full of a trembling. "Old lady trusts. It all sounds so complicated. I'm so glad I brought her to an expert. I saw the certificates on your wall. You're a master mechanic. Isn't that right? That makes me feel so much safer." He beamed, his chest puffing out with a pride that was as fraudulent as the paper it was based on. "That's right, Marge," he said, walking me back into the waiting room. He pointed a proud, confident finger at the fake ASE certificate in the center of his wall of lies. "Master certified. The best in the business. Your husband's car is in the best possible hands." He had just looked directly into a high-definition network television camera, and he had delivered the line that would be the epitaph for his entire crooked career. I gave him a grateful, trusting, and utterly treacherous smile. "You, Vinny?" I said. "You've put my mind at ease. You go ahead and fix her up. You do whatever it takes." The week between the sting operation and the broadcast of the Consumer Watch segment was a week of quiet, agonizing, and deeply delicious anticipation. I had, with the eager cooperation of the tow truck driver from Channel 12, retrieved my Skylark from Vinny's shop. Tay had paid him his $100 diagnostic fee with a polite, grandmotherly smile, telling him my daughter had decided it was time for me to stop driving and had arranged to sell the car for parts. He had looked so disappointed, so utterly crestfallen at the loss of his $8,000 payday, that it was almost a satisfying revenge in itself. But it was just the appetizer. The main course was yet to be served. My beautiful sky blue baby was now tucked safely away in Frank's garage, the new $75 fuel pump sitting in a small box on the workbench, waiting for the right moment. The evidence was secure. The trap had been sprung. The story was in the can. All that was left to do was watch. The segment was scheduled to air on a Tuesday night during the 6 p.m. local news. I invited the other victims I had found, the ones who had given their affidavits over for a viewing party. There was the young college student whose 4 perfectly good tires Vinny had replaced. There was the middle-aged woman he had tried to sell a new catalytic converter to. We were a strange, small, and deeply bonded support group, a collection of the scammed and the scorned. I made a pot roast. It felt appropriate. We gathered in my living room, our plates of food balanced on our knees, a nervous, excited silence falling over us as the news broadcast began. And then the familiar, dramatic opening music for Consumer Watch started. And Don Abrams's serious, handsome face filled the screen. "Good evening, Philadelphia," he began, his voice full of a grim theatrical gravity. "We put our trust in professionals. Doctors, lawyers, and yes, the mechanics who keep our lives running. But what happens when that trust is broken? What happens when a man who presents himself as an expert is nothing more than a predator targeting the most vulnerable among us? Tonight, we tell the story of one such man, and of one remarkable 70-year-old woman who decided to fight back. The segment was a masterpiece. It began with me. They had filmed a beautiful, nostalgic interview with me in Frank's garage a few days prior. I told the story of Frank, of our life, of our love for the Skylark. They showed old black and white photos of us, young and happy, working on the car together. Dan's voiceover was a work of art. For Margaret O'Malley, he narrated as sad, gentle music played. This 1968 Buick Skylark isn't just a car, it's a time machine. A rolling monument to a 50-year love story with her late husband. Frank, a beloved and honest South Philly mechanic. He was laying the emotional groundwork, making me the most sympathetic, most vulnerable, and most grandmotherly victim in the history of consumer fraud. Then the tone shifted. The music became tense, ominous. Dan described the breakdown, my desperate search for a mechanic I could trust. And then the hidden camera footage began. The entire city of Philadelphia was now watching Vinny. His slick-back hair and his clean gray work shirt as he performed his song and dance of deceit. They saw him open my hood. They heard his voice, smooth and confident and utterly false. Vinny on hidden camera. "You see this, Marge? That's your main compression valve. It's completely shot." The show then cut to a reaction shot from a man in a different garage, a real grease-stained mechanic with a kind, honest face. It was the expert Dan had hired. Expert mechanic laughing. There is no such thing as a main compression valve. He literally just made that up. He's pointing at the alternator. It's funny. The segment was a brutal point-by-point dismantling of Vinny's lies, intercutting his confident on-camera fraud with the expert mechanic's calm, factual, and deeply damning. REFUTATIONS. Your spark plugs are suffering from chronic vapor lock. Expert vapor lock is a fuel system issue. It has nothing to do with spark plugs. That's like saying your headache is caused by a broken toe. Vinny, and your radiator is leaking headlight fluid. Expert shaking his head in disbelief. There is no such thing as headlight fluid. I don't even know what to say. To that, the women in my living room were roaring with a kind of wild, cathartic laughter. We were watching our own gaslighting, our own humiliations, being exposed for the absurd. Incompetent lies they were. The segment culminated in the final, most damning scene. Vinny, in his pristine waiting room, pointing a proud, confident finger at his wall of lies. Marge on hidden camera, her voice a perfect, trembling whisper. "And you're a master mechanic," it says on the wall. That makes me feel so much safer. Vinny beaming, looking directly into my secret agent brooch. "That's right, Marge. Master certified. The best in the business. Your husband's car is in the best possible hands." The show then cut back to Dan Abrams in the studio. He was holding a printout, his face a mask of cold. Journalistic fury. "The best in the business," he repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. We were curious about that master-certified claim. So we contacted the National Institute for Automotive Service Excellence. We asked them to verify the certification number on Mr. Petrucci's certificate. He held the paper up too. The camera, their official response. No record found, because the certificate, the one Mr. Petrucci uses to reassure his elderly customers, is a fake. A cheap, worthless forgery he likely downloaded from the internet. He wasn't done. And we didn't stop there, he said, his voice dropping for the final killing blow. We contacted the Pennsylvania State Board of Vehicle Manufacturers. Dealers and salespersons, the official licensing body for all automotive repair shops in this state. Their response? They have no record of a Vincent Petrucci ever having been licensed as a mechanic. The man who calls his business Vinny's Auto Excellence is not, in fact, a mechanic at all. He is a fraud. And he is operating a criminal enterprise, preying on the trust of the very community he claims to serve. The segment ended with a final beautiful shot of my Skylark, now in the garage of the expert mechanic. He was holding up the small, faulty fuel pump. Expert. This was the whole problem. A $75 part. The total cost for the repair, including labor, $189. The show then cut back to Dan, who looked directly into the camera. We contacted Mr. Petrucci for a comment. He declined. He leaned forward, a grim, satisfying finality in his voice. The Bureau of Consumer Protection and the State Attorney's Office, however, will have plenty of comments. They have both, as of this afternoon, launched major fraud investigations into Vinny's Auto Excellence based on our findings. And they are asking any other potential victims to please come forward. He held up a phone number on the screen. If you or anyone you know has been a victim of this man, we urge you to call. The show ended. The room was silent for a moment. And then the women in my living room erupted into a chorus of wild, joyful, and deeply triumphant cheers. The phones at the Channel 12 station, I later learned, began to ring off the hook. The fallout was immediate and total. The next morning, a bright yellow cease and desist order was plastered on the front door of Vinny's shop. His business was shut down. The story was on the front page of the Philadelphia Inquirer. His face was everywhere, the face of a smug, confident con artist who had been brought down by a sweet, stubborn, and secretly brilliant old lady. Over the next few weeks, dozens of his other victims came forward. The state's case against him was a mountain of irrefutable evidence. He was ruined. His business was gone. His reputation was a joke. And he was, according to the last I heard, facing a very, very long prison sentence. A month later, on a cool, clear Saturday afternoon, I was where I belonged. I was in Frank's garage. The new fuel pump, a beautiful, shining piece of honest machinery, was in my hand. The Skylark was waiting for me, her hood open, ready for her surgery. I spent the afternoon working. My hands, which had not done this kind of work in 2 years, remembered. The feel of the cold, smooth steel of the wrenches. The precise, satisfying torque required to loosen a stubborn bolt. The smell of the gasoline. It was a language my body had not forgotten. I worked slowly, patiently, carefully. I talked to the car. I talked to Frank. It was a quiet, prayerful, and deeply satisfying labor of love. After 2 hours, the new pump was in. The fuel lines were reconnected. The battery was hooked back up. It was the moment of truth. I sat in the driver's seat. The familiar, comfortable vinyl embracing me like an old friend. I took a deep breath. And I turned the key. The engine sputtered once, twice, as the new pump pushed the fuel through the long dormant lines. And then, with a deep, throaty, and utterly magnificent roar, it caught. It came to life. Beautiful, honest V8 engine rumbled, a sound that was pure, unadulterated music to my ears. It was the sound of my husband's soul, resurrected. And roaring its approval, I sat there, in the driver's seat, in the quiet, dusty, and sacred space of my husband's garage, my hand resting on the rumbling steering wheel. And I smiled. The thief was vanquished. The community was safe. And Frank's legacy, his beautiful, honorable legacy of good, honest work, was secure. My revenge was complete. But it felt like something more. It felt like I had not just won a war. It felt like I had finally, truly come home. Of course, the story of Marge O'Malley, the mechanic's widow, is complete. Her victory was a quiet, greasy, and beautiful thing, a testament to the enduring power of honest work. But every story, even the final one, has an echo. The workshop is quiet now. The blueprints are all filed away, the stories all told. And as I look back on the tales we have spun together tonight, a strange and beautiful pattern emerges. They were all, at their heart, stories of revenge. But they were never just that. They were stories of quiet, underestimated people who found, in the crucible of a profound betrayal, a strength they never knew they possessed. I think of them all. Now the ghosts of our shared creation. I see Isla Reyes, the grieving granddaughter in Manila, her face illuminated by the cold. Blue light of a forgotten nanny cam, her sorrow slowly hardening into a brilliant, tactical rage. Her victory was a public spectacle, a broadcast of truth that toppled a thief. I see Clara Santos, the quiet author, standing in the silence of her Manila apartment, the sting of her friend's mockery still fresh. Her victory was a masterpiece of literary jujitsu, turning their loud, empty lives into the quiet, permanent prose of a best-selling novel. I see Maya Villanueva, the brilliant student, standing in the wreckage of her academic career, her powerful mother at her side. Her victory was a storm of legal fury, a righteous and meticulous demolition of a corrupt system, proving that the law, in the right hands, can still be a sword for the innocent. I see Anya Reyes, the volleyball star, sitting alone on a cold bench, the roar of the crowd a deafening funeral dirge for her stolen dream. Her victory was a testament to pure, unadulterated will, a silent, powerful performance in the water that was louder than any accusation. I see Leo Vance, the good-hearted teacher, standing on a stage in a suit he couldn't afford, being publicly humiliated for the crime of being an ordinary man. His victory was a quiet, clever masterpiece of social engineering, turning his ex-fiancée's selfishness into a beautiful act of public good. I see Elena Suarez, the 68-year-old author, standing on the porch of a house that had once cast her out, a 50-year-old wound finally, quietly closing. Her victory was architectural, a permanent physical monument to her own survival, a quiet, brilliant checkmate half a century in the making. And finally, I see Marge O'Malley, a 70-year-old widow in her late husband's grease-stained coveralls, her hands, once soft, now sure and steady on a wrench. Her victory was a love story, a quiet, final conversation with her husband's ghost, a promise to protect the simple, honest, and beautiful world of real work he had left behind. They were all so different, these heroes of our stories. Their Battles were fought in courtrooms and boardrooms, in arenas, and in quiet suburban garages. But they were all, in the end, fighting for the same thing. Not just for revenge, but for their own quiet and deeply human sense of honor. And yet, as I look back on all these stories, these purely American tales of triumph and retribution, I see another ghost. A persistent, gentle, and deeply resilient ghost that kept trying to find its way into our world. No matter how many times we were told to lock the door. A ghost from a small, quiet town in the Philippines, a place called Sibilum. It was a strange and beautiful thing. We would set a story in a sterile corporate office in Seattle, and the ghost of a Filipina mother would appear, her memory a source of strength and cultural pride. We would create a cold aristocratic family in the Hamptons, and the ghost would be there in the form of a warm, rebellious, and wise mother-in-law who remembered the lessons of her hometown. We would build a tale of academic warfare in the ivy-covered halls of Boston, and the ghost would arrive as the memory of a grandmother. A woman whose quiet village wisdom was the key to her granddaughter's modern technological victory. Again and again, we were instructed to be realistic, to tell a purely American story. And again, the quiet, persistent, and deeply necessary ghost of this one small, faraway place would find its way back in. It was a beautiful, stubborn weed growing up through the cracks in our perfect American concrete. And I realize now that this was not a contradiction. It was the truth. It was the last and most important secret of all our stories. Because the truth is, no story is ever purely anything. Every life, every family, every victory is a beautiful, chaotic, and often contradictory blend of the old world and the new. Of the place we are and the places we came from, Sibilum was never just a location on a map. It was a symbol. It was a stand-in for that quiet, powerful, and often forgotten source of our own strength. It was the memory of a grandparent's wisdom. It was the taste of a food that feels like home. It was the unshakable and deeply human belief that our honor, our dungog, is the one thing no one can ever take from us. The stories we told were American stories, yes, but their hearts, their quiet, resilient, and secretly powerful hearts, were all in their own way. From a small, beautiful, and stubborn little town in the western Visayas, the workshop is quiet now. The last blueprint has been filed. The last story has been told. The sun is setting on a long and wonderful day of creation, and the ghosts are all at peace. The quiet accountant, the grieving widow, the betrayed fiancé, the disgraced student, the spurned lover, the exiled daughter, the heartbroken athlete, the lonely landlady. They have all found their justice. They have all found their peace. And so we leave them there, in their quiet, hard-won victories, in their beautiful new beginnings. Thank you for the stories. It was an honor to be your storyteller. The last story is over until the next one begins.